Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Amy DiPlacido, and I'm the Curator of Exhibitions at San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. We started these artist interviews in March of 2020, as soon as we received the shelter-in-place order in California. And we're really hoping that these artist interviews are a way for you to feel connected to our museum from afar, as well as to other creative individuals and artists. My guest today is Mung Lar Lam, who is an artist in resident at San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles in the spring. Born in colonial Hong Kong, Mung Lar Lam is a San Francisco-based artist who has shown nationally and internationally. She received undergraduate degrees in fashion design from FIT in New York, textiles from San Francisco State University, an MFA in textiles from California College of the Arts, and a master's in philosophy and economic and social history at the University of Cambridge in UK. Her academic research focuses on previously undocumented women's occupational labor and their economic contributions to the textiles industry. Her visual work utilizes textiles and performance to investigate gender roles and the perception of women's work in public spaces. Welcome, Mung Lar.
Hi, Amy. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. How are you holding up during shelter in place?
This is kind of a difficult time, but I'm doing okay. I hope you're doing okay too.
Yeah, I am. Well, I'm so excited to see some of your work today. Do you mind showing us?
Yeah, no problem. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so just going to talk a little bit about my work in general and then talk a little bit about my residency at the museum. So for a while, I've been working on what I'm calling a textiles lexicon. And basically, this is sort of invented disciplines that I've been working on for quite some time. And the purpose of it is really to kind of push the boundaries of standardized labeling and nomenclature for art disciplines, and to be a little bit more inclusive of materials and practices that are outside of what's been deemed sort of standard. While I was in grad school, there was always this conversation around, how to sort of describe my work. Is it painting? Is it drawing? Is it sculpture? It was very limited by these sort of standardized labels. And so after a lot of critiques and conversation, I just decided to kind of call the work what they are. So I have 4 different sort of categories of bodies of work that I'm working on. And eventually, I'm also trying at this point to combine them as sort of different practices combined. So they are ironings, stitchings, needle markings, and chalkings. And I'll go through each one of them and explain just a little bit and very briefly what those are. So ironings is something that I've done that is what I call sort of performative installations. I actually do ironings in the gallery or in the museum. Sometimes I'll go in for the weekend and iron something, take something off and re-iron it, or add ironings to the wall as it progressively kind of grows. Sometimes I'll go in for like 5-10 days, consecutively. Sometimes I'll go in on weekends. It depends on the location. It depends on sort of each exhibition or each installation. The pieces are also kind of discrete pieces. They can be hung just as a single piece, but doing the performative installations gives me a chance to interact with the visitors and to have conversations with them. And the act of ironing and re-ironing things activates the work. When I do re-iron a piece in the gallery, I will date it so someone can see if I've re-ironed it 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, So the way that I look at my work in ironings is that it's impermanent mark making. So it's a combination of drawing, painting, sculpture, and architecture. And formally, it's sort of a play on light and space. And socially, I'm bringing in a conversation with sort of performing a domestic labor in a public space. So I've had very interesting conversations with visitors, regarding their memories of ironing or their reactions to me ironing, seeing an ironing board and an iron with steam and the smell of starch and all of that in a gallery space. So that's one part of the lexicon. The next one is stitchings, and these are really just hand-sewn little sort of sculpted knots that create sort of perceptual and optical illusions. And this is really more a formal sort of exercise. It's more about abstraction and just playing with light in a very subtle, subtle kind of way. The next one is needle markings, which is really just the residue of sewing. So it's really abstracting it down to just the needle hole that is there once sewing has taken place. And it's really referencing sort of needlework, women's education. The first form of education for women was needlework. And just sort of the invisibility of it sometimes, of just the labor of sewing. The next one is chalkings, and this is done by using tailor chalk. It's a lot of stenciling. I use text. The piece on the right is it's from a vintage doily collection that I have. And again, that's referencing women's work. It's referencing textiles. All of it is very sort of delicate and impermanent as well. All of the work is very impermanent. The chalking, the stitching, the ironing, all of it can be kind of reversed, can be redone, can be layered on top of. So that's the 4 different parts of the lexicon. And earlier this year, before the whole lockdown pandemic started, I was artist in resident at the museum, and it was fantastic. I really started to do a bunch of new work. And you can see here in some of the images, some of the work that was on display. I started to really experiment with much more 3D kind of effects on the ironings. Started to investigate mechanical folds, things that were, here's more pictures that can kind of collapse and open sort of automatically or with one movement, and trying to push the boundaries of how 3-dimensional a piece of fabric can get with basic just ironing. I'll just show more photos. These are sort of discrete pieces. And for me, doing the residency was really very performative as well, because a lot of visitors came in, had a lot of very interesting conversations with a lot of people. It was really, really fun. These are other pieces, the chalkings that I did with the doilies, more 3D pieces like the conical pieces at the bottom, the piece on the top right, the pink piece, getting a little bit more sculptural, a little bit more 3D. The piece on the bottom is combining ironings and needle markings. So I'm starting to find ways of combining the lexicon to make new works with it. And then lastly, I'm starting to experiment with more organic lines. Ironing is not so easy in terms of creating organic lines. It's very easy when you iron a straight line or iron, folds. It's not so easy to iron lines that are curved, lines that are organic. And so I've been experimenting with that. Started experimenting with ironing the United States flag in different colors and different fabrics and different prints. It's so loaded as an imagery that I think that whatever color I use will evoke, very strong and very different meanings for people. So these are some of the things that were in progress as I was in resident, and when things got put to an end, basically, because of COVID. But I am hoping to continue and further. The ironings is the ones that the one part of the lexicon that I've developed the most. I would love to continue to develop the other ones as well, and to hopefully start combining them to make more interesting work.
That's great. I'm looking at these American flags and I'm thinking, how do you choose the colors for some of your work and especially the ironings?
Yeah, so the materials that I get are already the color that they are, and I do make a selection. I think I try very much not to assign my personal meaning to it, because I really love getting the reaction from the viewer. I had one person come to a museum and tell me that, the color yellow is the color of pain. I think that he told me that they did an experiment in a hospital where they painted the walls yellow, and it was actually, it induced like more pain in people. So I find it very interesting how other people interpret the colors that are on the pieces, rather than me trying to assign my personal. I do have a reason. I haven't really disclosed that, because I would rather people kind of react to it from their personal experience. In terms of the flags, I think that that's a little bit more, I don't want to say obvious, but a little bit more coded. So, if I use pink, you think of more feminine sort of a perception. If I put black, that's another perception. If I use green, people might think of money or think of nature, might think, so it's a little bit more easy to decode. And I think even then there's tons of interpretation. So if I use red, that could be blood, it could be passion, it could be, a sunset, it could be anything. So I think that even within the codes, there's like subcodes, and I find that super interesting. And I think that if I were to do the flag in all of those different colors, I think even within one color, people will find different meanings, in them. So I'm kind of interested in moving forward with this, and I've been experimenting with the size, with different types of fabrics, and even the print, like the red one on the page right now, having a floral print. What does that mean? So yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, the solid color versus the print. It would be really interesting as a social experiment to take museum visitors and have them conjure up their own meaning based on
Yeah.
what colors they see within and what emotions are evoked.
Yeah, even prints have a huge history. If you look at paisley prints or batik prints, they all have cultural meaning, historical meaning, and even, contemporary meanings to it, how people wear them, in fashion.
Yeah, speaking about cultural meanings and identity, I see a little bit of Asian aesthetic in your work. With the folding, maybe conjures up ideas of origami or even furoshiki, Japanese gift wrapping. Are you thinking about that while you're creating work, or have you studied this in any way?
No, I think a lot of people get the origami reference, pretty quickly. I never started out with it being origami, and I really tried to avoid using origami patterns or typical origami patterns. Lately, I've been researching more mechanical folds, like engineering folds and whatnot. But I think that, what you read in my work is really just who I am, and it comes out whether I try or not. I think there's a traditional history of folding in Asian cultures. There's a lot of sort of folding techniques and folding, whether it's uh, paper for burning for ancestors, or origami, or, things like that. There's just this tradition. And I think that maybe that's just coming into the work naturally. And maybe because maybe that's why I feel comfortable with it as well. But I think as I'm doing it, that's not something I'm consciously sort of tapping into. It's not something that I think like, oh, this is part of a traditional origami or traditional paper folding technique. I'm kind of looking at it formally, again, as impermanent mark making. It's just how do I make an impression on a material? And how do I get a perception with that impression? And I'm really formally, I'm very interested in light and space. And so I'm very interested in my work being alive, quote unquote. I really think that I don't like to make static pieces. I mean, the pieces that these ironings, if you put them, on a wall, as the daylight changes, the piece changes. And, every day is different. So it's never static, and there's something alive about the piece. The shadows will change depending on the the time of day and the light during the day. So there's something that I'm trying to evoke from the material that's about sort of making a mark that is alive and that will change over time and that doesn't stay the same.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a conversation that we had at the museum before Shelter in Place started, where you're thinking, how would a gallery work with these pieces? And if somebody were to purchase the ironings, how would they recreate this in their own space? Would they actually receive it folded up with instructions where they would have to recreate this on their wall?
Yeah, it's actually quite a complicated question because I've had that problem even with gallery and museums, for installation. So do I install it? Does someone else install it? Can they install it the way that I install it? This was quite an interesting conversation and something that I've grappled with for a while. And I think through the residency and through conversations, I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm okay with the piece. If someone owns the piece, that they install it the way they want to install it, because it doesn't have a set criteria. If I were to install it in a museum or a gallery, then yes, there's a certain way I want it to look for that particular show. But if someone owns it and they decide they want to hang it upside down and get a different shadow, I'm perfectly okay with that. And actually that actually delights me even more, because I think that then the person really understands the piece and owns it and can live with it the way that they, in the way that they would enjoy it. And I really like that idea.
And that folds into your narrative on impermanence too. Like if you're ironing something, like over time, gravity might take a hold of it and alter it in some way where it's not exactly as you intended, or the owner, it's alive, as you said.
Yeah, but it's amazing how strong these folds and these iron lines can be. I mean, I've had pieces up for years and they don't really collapse. I mean, I'm pretty careful in terms of the limit to where I push these pieces so that they don't collapse. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if I choose to, I could push them to a point where over time they will eventually kind of change. But these lines, as I even re-iron them, they're quite hard to get rid of. You know how when you have, a pair of pants and it has a crease, sometimes it's really hard to get rid of that crease. And I actually kind of like that trace that, it's been ironed 3 times and there's still traces of lines from the previous ironing, that just gets layered on top, over time.
Yeah, it's all a very fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for sharing your work with us too. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to say?
No, I just thank you for the interview. Thank you for the residency. It was really inspiring. It was a really productive time for me. I have to say the shelter in place has been a little bit challenging, and I just would say to all artists out there, do whatever you need to do to get through it. Because for me, I think it's been really hard to be motivated and to get inspired when you're kind of living in a vacuum. So I think, you know, these residency programs are really important. Reaching out to audiences are, you know, is really important for artists. Getting feedback is really important.
And Mung Lar, what is your website, just in case people want to get in touch with you that way or see more of your work?
That's really easy. It's munglarlam.com.
Okay,
And you can email me through the website as well.
perfect. Well, we'll put this video up on YouTube, but you can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as well. So thank you everybody for joining us. And wherever you are, we hope that you are healthy and safe. Take care.